Hello, I want to pick up talking about enthymemes right where I left off in the last video. I had to cut that one off very abruptly because I had to go do something. I'm recording here in my home, in my little study nook, and sometimes I get interrupted. So I'm just going to pick up talking about enthymemes right now, right where I left off. And remember that an enthymeme is an incomplete argument. It's either going to have a premise missing or it's going to have a conclusion missing. And we need to supply those to reconstruct the argument in order to evaluate it properly. So arguing through an enthymeme can be very powerful when you leave out the conclusion. That's because when somebody is talking to an audience, if the audience supplies the conclusion themselves, in other words, the speaker sort of lays out the premises, and then the audience is following along, and then they draw the conclusion themselves, that's very powerful in a rhetorical sense because it makes everyone feel like they came up with it themselves. So someone might argue that Obamacare will help us have a healthier population, which will cut down on visits to the ER by people with no insurance, so there will be less stress on the healthcare system. So clearly this person wants you to draw the conclusion that Obamacare should not be repealed and that it should stay law. And it makes it a more powerful argument rhetorically, not logically, but rhetorically, in terms of the force of it, because the audience is drawing that conclusion for themselves based on the premises. Now, this leads us to what is known among philosophers with what is known as the principle of charity. And remember at the beginning of this class, I said that in philosophy, an argument is not a debate. It's not trying to win. It's not trying to persuade someone to your point of view or score points. It's not what we see politicians doing. An argument is a joint attempt to get at the truth. And I'd also said that for a philosopher, it's a valuable thing to be shown you're wrong. So when a philosopher is arguing with someone, and they want to make that opponent's argument as strong as they can, so that it will be a real argument and will give them a better chance at getting at the truth. And this is called the principle of charity. When you reconstruct the argument, you try to make it the best argument you can. Consider someone accusing someone of the following. Someone sees some professor demonstrating in the street, say, against a war. And he says to them, look, some of you professors are anti-war activists, so some of you professors are not patriots. The professor might kindly reply, because he's operating by that principle of charity and wants to find out if maybe he's wrong. I think what you really meant to say was, no anti-war activist is a patriot. Some professor is an anti-war activist, so some professor is not a patriot. Yeah, the accuser says, that's exactly what I meant. The professor could then reply, well, let's talk about your argument then. It's a better argument now. It's actually a valid argument, but is it sound? Which means that if the premises are true, right? If the premises are true, it's a valid argument, but are the premises true? And I could begin to argue with that person about that. I could point out to him, for example, that I'd been an army officer and that I wasn't against all wars. I was against unjust wars, or whatever. We could begin to have a good argument, which would be a joint attempt to get at the truth. So the professor has actually given the person he's arguing with a better argument against his own position. That might seem strange. And to remember, again, that an argument in philosophy is not a debate, but a joint attempt to get at the truth. So a philosopher would accept being proven wrong without a fuss, or maybe even with some delight. So crazy are we philosophers. If you prove me wrong, and you've really proven me wrong, I might do a little dance, buy you a beer or a cup of wine to thank you. Right? And also, on the other hand, if you can refute someone's argument, prove them wrong, and you've done it against the best possible version of their argument, you have shown it to be a very bad argument indeed, and that would be a good thing too. Because philosophers are also happy when they prove other people wrong, because then they've learned something new too. Now I want to talk to you about another thing, right? So let's shift gears. And I want to talk to you about the difference between an argument and an explanation. Arguments and explanations can seem very much alike, but they're very different. And arguments and explanations both have a single statement they're focusing on. And in an argument, we call that statement the conclusion. It's what we're arguing for, as we've talked about. In an explanation, the statement that we're trying to get at in our explanation is called the explanandum. The explanandum, which means the explanation for what you're trying to explain. Aren't that word's nice? All the other statements in an argument or explanation are focused on either the conclusion in an argument or the explanandum in an explanation. Remember, in an argument, these statements that support the conclusion are called premises, and they give us reasons for thinking that the conclusion is true. But in an explanation, these other statements are called the explanans, and provide information about how or why the explanation is true. So in both cases, we have a group of statements all focused on one single statement, and that's why it might be so easy to confuse them. So remember what an argument is. It's an attempt to provide support for a truth claim. The primary issue that an argument tries to resolve is whether or not that conclusion is true or not. So we have the conclusion versus the explanandum, premises versus the explanans. In an argument, we might have premise 1, premise 2, premise 3, and a conclusion, while in an explanation, we'd have an explanans 1, explanans 2, explanans 3, and the explanandum. So, suppose you're wondering if Dr. G, that's me, is a Star Wars fan or not. During happier times, when it was possible to do so, you went to his office and you noticed he had an exact model of a lightsaber wielded by Luke Skywalker in the movies, signed by Mark Hamill himself. You also would notice that he had a figure of Yoda on his bookshelf, as well as Rey Skywalker and Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi and Han Solo. You also remembered, or maybe have heard, that in class many of his logic examples use Star Wars references. So you thought, maybe, the following. Premise 1. Dr. G has a lightsaber signed by Mark Hamill in his office. Premise 2. Dr. G has a figure of Yoda on his bookshelf. Dr. 3, excuse me. It's so funny recording lectures. Number 3, Dr. G always talks about Star Wars in his logic classes. Therefore, Dr. G is a Star Wars fan. Right? What makes this an argument instead of an explanation is that you don't know whether or not Dr. G is a Star Wars fan, and you're looking for evidence of that, right? Maybe you've never taken a class with him and you're just wondering. So you visited his office, you noticed the following, and you heard from other students that he talked about Star Wars in his logic classes, so you put together this little argument to try to figure that out. In contrast, the main purpose of an explanation is to provide a deeper understanding that is already accepted as true. The focal point of an explanation, which remember we call the explanandum, is usually already accepted by the people in the conversation. We accept that a certain thing is true, but we want a better understanding of why it's true. Suppose your car won't start. You go out and your car won't start, and you want to know why it won't start. Is it a dead battery? A messed up spark plug? Is it 2020? And everything else is going to effing hell. So it makes sense that my car won't start. It's the curse of 2020. Then you look up and realize you turned on the dome light last night to look at something in your logic book, because you carry it with you everywhere and you're always studying logic. So you form an explanation to try to understand the truth of your car not starting. You want to explain it to yourself. So, explanans 1. I left the dome light on. Explanans 2, leaving the light on drains the battery. Explanans 3, a dead battery won't allow the car to start. Explanandum, the car won't start because the battery is dead. The important thing to remember here is that finding out you left the lights on is not the reason you believe that your car won't start, because you already know your car won't start because you turned the key and nothing happened. There's nothing to prove here. Noticing that your lights were left on doesn't make you even more convinced that your car won't start. It just helps you understand why your car won't start. This is an explanation, because the other facts help us understand why the final statement is true, but they aren't used to show that the final statement is true or to prove it. This difference is the key point in understanding the difference between arguments and explanations. Now, how can we tell whether someone is arguing or explaining? Sometimes the speaker doesn't even know whether they are arguing or explaining, especially if they haven't studied logic. But it's important to be able to tell the difference, both when listening to others and with coming up with our own arguments and explanations. This is because arguments and explanations are trying to accomplish different goals, and what makes an effective argument does not make an effective explanation. And sometimes people will give you explanations as if they were arguments. Sometimes they'll give you arguments as if they were explanations, which is a real bit of logical confusion, which makes the Vulcan in me very sad. Now, a good way to start telling whether a passage is an argument or not is to identify the main point of what's being said, which will be either the conclusion if it's in an argument, or the explanandum if it's an explanation. What you're looking for is the statement that will be the conclusion or explanandum. So ask yourself, if this is an argument, what is its conclusion? What is this person trying to prove, and what reasons are they giving to me for thinking so? Once you've identified the potential conclusion, try to determine whether the author is attempting to convince you that the statement is true, or whether the author assumes you agree with the statement and is trying to help you understand why or how the statement is true. If they are trying to convince you, they are arguing. If they are trying to help you get a deeper understanding, they are explaining. Remember, the difference between arguing and explaining has more to do with the goal of the conversation than with the structure. Think about our example with the car. It's an explanation because you already know your car won't start. You just want to know why. So in an explanation, you use because to provide reasons for how an event occurred, and it's an already accepted fact. You know it's true. Compare these two statements from your book. Because you started lifting weights without first getting a physical checkup, you will probably injure your back. With your back injury occurred because you lifted weights without first getting a physical checkup. It's an explanation here, right? Because you already know you have a back injury. It's an already accepted fact. Your back injury occurred because you lifted weights without first getting a physical checkup. And also make sure you get a physical checkup before you do your lightsaber practice. There are some fine medics and physicians in the Jedi Temple. But this is an argument. Because you started lifting weights without first getting a physical checkup, you will probably injure your back. And the same would be true with your lightsaber practice. So may the Force be with you. Now, consider exercise 1C in your book, which I'll be asking you to do some of, right? So you're given a statement. I couldn't do my homework yesterday because I had to work a double shift yesterday. And you're going to tell me whether it's an explanation or an argument. And clearly it's an explanation because it's already a fact and that the homework was not done. So an explanation is offered, right? And notice you need to tell me if it's an explanation or an argument, and then briefly explain your reasoning to make clear what's going on. So that's enough for this little video. I've enjoyed talking with you and trying to, as it were, stretch out with the Force to feel you listening to me. I wish I could. Oh, well. But I want to thank you for your kind attention, and I look forward to seeing you in our Zoom meetings. please be careful. Please take care of yourself. And again, may the force be with you.